I wasn't cheated on. I was slowly removed from my own life. There was no fight, no shouting, no moment where everything collapsed. Everything stayed calm, too calm. That's how I knew something was wrong. This isn't a story about betrayal. It's about what happens when someone slowly edits you out, and how I noticed it too late. I've always been good at adjusting, not in the way people usually mean it, not shrinking myself out of fear or trying to be liked. It was a skill I learned early and carried like a tool. I could read rooms. I could feel when to soften a sentence, when to pause, when to let someone else finish a thought I'd already understood. I took pride in that. It made life smoother, quieter, efficient. I knew how to become the version of myself that fit the space I was in. At work, it made me valuable. In friendships, it made me easy to be around. I wasn't loud, but I wasn't invisible either. I existed comfortably between those extremes. I used to think adaptability meant strength, that it meant I could survive anywhere, with anyone. I liked the idea that I didn't need to fight to be heard, that I could bend without breaking. People often described me as easy in the nicest way. Low drama, rational, balanced. I never confused this with self-erasure. At least, not then. I thought I knew the difference. I thought there was a solid center inside me that stayed intact no matter how much I adjusted on the surface. That was the version of myself I trusted, the one I believed couldn't be misplaced. I met Mark during a period when my life felt crowded, but strangely unanchored. He entered it quietly. No charm offensive, no intensity, just calm. He listened the way people say they want others to listen, without interrupting, without performing interest. When I spoke, he didn't rush to respond. He waited. That felt like respect. He asked careful questions, not invasive ones, clarifying ones. He seemed genuinely interested in how I thought, not just what I felt. I remember noticing how precise his language was. Every word felt chosen, intentional, like nothing slipped out accidentally. He didn't push. He never told me what to do. If anything, he framed everything as a suggestion, a refinement. What if you phrased it this way? Wouldn't it be clearer if you tried this instead? It felt collaborative, like teamwork. Being around him felt like stepping into a quieter room after too much noise. I mistook that relief for safety. I didn't notice how quickly I started deferring to his sense of order, how easily his version of clear became the default. At the time, it didn't feel like giving anything up. It felt like upgrading, like aligning myself with something more stable, more controlled. I thought I was choosing calm. I didn't realize calm could be directional. Our relationship developed without friction. That's what I told people. No fights, no drama. We communicated well. Mark was proud of that. He valued emotional maturity the way some people value punctuality. It was something to be maintained. He had a way of framing things so that disagreement felt unnecessary. Not forbidden, just inefficient. If I pushed back, he'd listen, nod, and then rephrase my point more cleanly than I had, more logically. It made arguing feel redundant. Over time, I started editing myself before speaking. Not because he asked me to, but because I'd learned what would land better. Shorter sentences, fewer qualifiers, less emotion. I noticed I wrote messages differently too. More concise, more neutral. I told myself this was growth. He often praised me for being reasonable, for not reacting impulsively, for understanding context. Those compliments became a framework. I adjusted myself to keep fitting inside it. I didn't feel controlled. I felt optimized, like I was becoming a more refined version of myself. But refinement is subtraction, and I didn't notice how much was being removed because nothing was taken all at once, just smoothed down, softened, simplified. The changes were subtle enough that I couldn't point to a single moment where something went wrong. There was no argument that broke us open, no betrayal that demanded confrontation, just a gradual quieting. I stopped telling certain stories because they required too much explanation. I stopped expressing uncertainty because it disrupted the rhythm of our conversations. When I was upset, I waited until I could describe it calmly, neatly, without excess. By then, it often felt unnecessary to bring it up at all. Mark never told me I was too much. He never had to. His silence did the work. The pauses when I spoke too emotionally. The slight recalibrations in tone. The way he'd gently reframe my feelings into something more palatable. I began to recognize myself less in my own reflections, not in a dramatic way, just small things. I laughed less loudly. I chose my clothes more carefully, neutral colors, clean lines, nothing distracting. It wasn't that I was unhappy. That's the part that makes this hard to explain. I was functional, productive, stable. I just wasn't expanding anymore. I was maintaining, preserving a version of myself that took up less space because it fit better into his world. I didn't discover the affair the way stories usually describe it. There was no suspicious message, no late-night phone calls, no sudden secrecy. Mark was too consistent for that. He didn't have gaps in his behavior. He had compartments. I noticed it through logistics, a name mentioned casually, a schedule adjustment that didn't include me, the ease with which another woman seemed to exist alongside our life, not interrupting it, integrated, efficient. There was no chaos around her presence. That was what struck me. She wasn't hidden. She was simply placed where I no longer was, as if my absence had already been accounted for. When I realized what was happening, I didn't feel shock. I felt clarity, a quiet alignment of details that had been waiting to make sense. His calm hadn't been loyalty, it had been management. He didn't cheat impulsively. He didn't lose control. He made room. And I understood then that this wasn't a deviation from who he was. It was a continuation. The system had evolved. I just hadn't been updated. It took time for the realization to settle, not because it was complicated, but because it reframed everything. The affair wasn't the wound, it was the evidence. I saw our relationship differently once I stopped looking at it emotionally. From the outside, it was obvious. I had been phased out gradually, replaced not by another woman, but by a version of life that didn't require me. The most unsettling part was how little anger I felt. Not because I forgave him, but because there was nothing to argue with. He hadn't broken a promise in the way I'd been taught to recognize. He'd simply restructured. I understood then that I hadn't been betrayed. I'd been deprecated. Mark didn't need to erase me violently. He just stopped allocating space. That realization hurt in a way that shouting never could, because it wasn't about being unwanted. It was about being unnecessary. And that is much harder to defend against. There's no confrontation for that, no apology that fixes it. I didn't cry when I confronted him. I didn't need to. I already knew the truth. I was no longer part of the system he was building. Revenge wasn't an impulse. It wasn't fueled by rage or humiliation. It came from the same place my adaptability always had, from observation, from understanding structure. Mark valued documentation, precision, narrative control. He believed in records, in how things appeared when laid out cleanly. So that's where I worked. I gathered what already existed: emails, proposals, notes, timelines. I didn't fabricate anything. I didn't embellish. I simply arranged the information in a way that reflected reality. I used his language, his tone, his standards. I didn't accuse. I clarified. I didn't attack. I contextualized. The result wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was undeniable. A clear outline of decisions, overlaps, omissions. A version of events that required no emotional interpretation. I wasn't trying to punish him. I was documenting myself back into existence, making visible what had been quietly edited out. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't adjusting. I was asserting, not loudly, precisely, and that felt more powerful than anger ever could. When the consequences unfolded, they did so quietly, appropriately. There was no public spectacle, no confrontation scene, just a subtle shift in how he was perceived, how his narrative held up under scrutiny. I wasn't watching for his reaction. That wasn't the point. What mattered was that the record now reflected truth, that my absence had context, that it wasn't interpreted as a failure on my part. People often think revenge needs an audience. I didn't. I needed alignment. I needed my experience to exist in a form that couldn't be dismissed as emotional or subjective. Mark didn't argue the facts. He couldn't. He respected structure too much for that. In a way, he taught me exactly how to do this. He just never expected to be the subject. There was no satisfaction in watching him recalibrate, just relief. The kind that comes when something finally makes sense. When you stop wondering what you did wrong and start seeing what was done. I didn't win. That wasn't the goal. I simply stopped being invisible. After everything settled, I noticed how slowly I started to take up space again, not all at once, in increments. I spoke longer. I laughed without checking the volume. I wrote the way I used to, with texture and excess. It felt unfamiliar at first, like returning to a language I hadn't used in a while. I wasn't sure which parts of me were still intact, which had been permanently smoothed away. But they came back. The color, the unpredictability, the parts that didn't optimize well. I realized they had never been flaws. They were simply incompatible with a system that required control. I no longer felt the urge to pre-edit myself. If something needed clarification, I let it be unclear. If an emotion was messy, I didn't rush to organize it. I stopped translating myself into something easier to process. That was the real aftermath. Not the end of the relationship, but the end of my own reduction. I wasn't trying to fit anymore. I wasn't trying to be efficient. I was whole again, and that was enough. Looking back, I don't frame the story as one of loss. I wasn't taken from. I was released from a structure that couldn't hold me without diminishing me. Mark didn't break me. He didn't betray me in the dramatic sense. He simply optimized his life in a way that excluded my presence. And I let that happen longer than I should have, because I mistook adaptation for strength. I don't regret being adaptable. It's still a skill. But I now understand its limits. Adjustment should never require disappearance. Calm should never come at the cost of voice. The affair was never the point. It was just the final data point in a pattern that had been forming quietly for a long time. The pattern of being managed instead of met. I don't need closure from him. I already have it. It exists in the fact that I no longer have to make myself smaller to be understood. He didn't break me. He optimized me out. And I chose to return in full size.